Good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you for this evening's talk by Professor Padma Sarangapani. We are very pleased to have a very well-known educationist who is very extremely passionate about learning and teaching speak to us today in our Seminars on Education series of the Astronomy Center for Education of IUCA. After obtaining an MSc in Physics from IIT Madras, Professor Sarangapani went on to do a PhD in Education at the University of Delhi. Professor Sarangapani is presently Professor of Education and Chairperson of the Center of Excellence in Teacher Education at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences at Mumbai. Her current research interests includes a very wide range: culture and pedagogy, and comparative education and teachers' professional development. She has contributed on a wide range of issues to national policy, including the National Curriculum Framework of 2005 as a member of the steering group, and has been involved in several policy initiatives on the central government and also UNESCO. She has led several field action projects, collaborating with state governments to address issues of quality, teacher professional development, and school systems improvement. The Connected Learning Initiative, which you can learn a lot more about from the TIS website, which involved using technology in secondary schools in several states in the country, including far-flung Mizoram. School settings was awarded. This initiative was awarded the UNESCO King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa Award for the use of ICTs in education 2018. She was founding editor of Contemporary Education Dialogue. Her most recent publication is the Handbook of Education Systems in South Asia, a Springer major reference work, of which she is co-editor-in-chief 2021. She'll speak to us today on ideas that matter, some key imperatives and insights that have changed the way we think about learning and teaching. We look forward to your talk, Professor Sarangapani. Could I invite you to deliver your talk? And thank you very much. And you may take questions either in the middle or in the end, as you wish. Thanks a lot.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Dr. Saikia, for this invitation. I'm really pleased to be a part of this forum that you have at IUCA. We've had a long association. In fact, IUCA was one of our collaborators in CLICS. So very pleased to be connecting professionally again with this institute and this community that you have built around the Teaching Learning Center. So I want to speak about ideas that matter. And I basically want to share with you some, three ideas that have changed the way in which I think about learning, teaching, and education. And I also think that this is larger than my individual journey. I think these have been very important, influential ideas in the Indian context. And I want to discuss what these ideas are and also why I think they're important and why I'm calling this talk Ideas That Matter. So many of us teachers have experienced, so before I go into it, I don't have a presentation to share. I kind of ran out of time, but it was also proving to be difficult to organize what I wanted to say in slides. So I hope you'll just pay attention to what I'm going to speak. So let me start again. Many of us teachers may have experienced that a grasp of the content of what we need to teach, along with reflection and an intuitive sense that enables us to put ourselves in our learners' shoes, is what enables us to teach. In other words, our knowledge of content and our innate intuitive reflection and ability to put ourselves into our learners' shoes really seems to guide the way we teach. This is not a wrong or misplaced intuition. The primatologist Primark observes that Homo sapiens have evolved to have a pedagogical instinct. And this is what enables the transmission of culture, which is very distinctively human. And the cognitive psychologist Brunner calls this a folk pedagogy. This is the idea that pedagogy is human cognition is hardwired for interrelational pedagogical capability, just the way in which we are hardwired to apprehend and experience the world and phenomena in terms of space, time, causality. We have this innate theory of mind that enables us to apprehend and engage with other human beings. In the same way, we seem to be hardwired to be teaching beings. And it's this instinctive capability that accounts for tutors who are successful in tuition classes, even without having ever been to a teacher education program. Moreover, our own culture values teachers, and it provides us with cultural resources in the form of stories, metaphors, sayings, that not only codes for us what teachers do, but also provides us with the basis to justify what works and what it doesn't work as teachers. And this is probably the reason for this widespread skepticism, especially in Indian society, that is there really need for teacher preparation like B.Ed? Today, I want to talk about a few ideas that have changed my own folk pedagogical ideas and have also shaped and contributed to my own shaking away of the skepticism that there is something to be learned and understood about teaching, which we don't just inherit as a part of our folk pedagogy. I encountered one of these ideas very early in my introduction to the discipline at Delhi University. And the last idea that I will discuss today is an idea of the implications of which I have not fully derived for myself. So the first idea I want to introduce is the idea of pedagogical content knowledge. This is the idea that the nature of knowledge of content matters in teaching. It's probably a truism to say that you can teach only things that you know about. That is, content knowledge is a prerequisite to being able to teach. And it's commonplace to critically observe that many teachers of maths and science don't seem to have content knowledge. And this accounts for why they're not able to teach well and why they're not able to realize learning outcomes for their students. However, it's also a common experience that content knowledge itself may not be sufficient for teaching. How you know it, how you think about it, and how you present it to your learners is as important, if not more important, than the knowledge of content itself. In lay language, many people talk about this as communication ability as being the differentiator. People say that, they may know their content, they don't know how to communicate. We owe it to the educational researcher Schulman the insight that in order to teach content, you need to know content in a different way. And he called this knowledge of content pedagogical content knowledge. So in his own words, I will just read out a longish quote. Pedagogical content knowledge embodies the aspects of content most germane to its teachability. Within the category of pedagogical content knowledge, I include, for the most regularly taught subjects in one subject areas, the most useful forms of representation of these ideas, the most powerful analogies, illustrations, examples, explanations, demonstrations. In a word, the ways of representing and formulating the subject that makes it comprehensible to others. It also includes an understanding of what makes learning of specific concepts easy or difficult, the conceptions or the preconceptions that students of different ages and backgrounds bring to them to learning. This is akin to what it takes to know a landscape and make it comprehensible to a new traveler in a landscape. As you travel, as you direct somebody to go through a landscape, you will call out particular features to them. You will introduce them to landmarks that you use to navigate the landscape or anchor familiarization of the landscape, and you will mark out their significance for a traveler. In the same way, Schulman suggests that teachers of content know the content through the lens of its teachability and how to represent this knowledge, understanding of what makes things easy or difficult, understanding of learners and their preconceptions regarding the subject matter, including the backgrounds that learners bring into the learning situation. All these constitute what Schulman describes as pedagogical content knowledge. This contribution of Schulman has altered the way in which educationists now think about the content of knowledge that teachers need to have and how it makes a difference to the quality of teaching. We often in our professional discourse refer to this as PCK. PCK provides us with clues about, good textbooks. Some of us have recognized some textbooks as being very good. And clearly, it is the PCK of the authors of that textbooks which is playing out in these textbooks, and how they present the subject matter, how they select the pegs for the topic, the questions that they put in, even the use of illustrations in textbooks, all demonstrate not only the author's knowledge of content, but also their knowledge and understanding of learners, the process of learning, and rendering this content teachable. It may seem that PCK is developed by teachers as a part of their personal journey of discovery and figuring it out. In fact, most of us who have gained reputations of good teachers have probably discovered many things. But in fact, it's not just our personal experiences of discovery that have contributed to our own ability to teach. We have, in fact, picked up many ideas from textbooks that we have read, resources that we have used and explored, and perhaps even conversations with colleagues. We are now realizing that this is a professional knowledge that can come to be shared in a community of professional educators with other educators. Often teaching learning resources is where PCK comes to get coded and takes the form of an artifact. The textbook is one such artifact that I already discussed, but it could also be simulations or models which are designed from this insight of a particular experience that you want learners to undergo, and specific pegs on which you want their concept development to hinge. And you are able to enable a learner to experience content mediated through insight of PCK. So in fact, it seems that PCK need not be just a personal knowledge that teachers acquire, but they can become a part of what we now in education recognize as professional knowledge belonging to this professional community of teachers and educators. In contexts such as India, where we have several first generation school or college goers, PCK presents new dimensions of understanding. For example, understanding what experiences students bring into the classroom, the funds of knowledge that they bring in. And this requires us to actually reconfigure how to relate subject matter to context, and how to demonstrate new forms of relevance and significance that are linked to social or cultural contexts other than the ones that we ourselves have experienced. More than any other idea, PCK has altered our understanding of content knowledge and what teaching and teacher education needs to do for prospective teachers in terms of their ability to understand content and operationalize this knowledge into the classroom. So this is the first idea that I wanted to share with you, which has really altered the way I have come to understand content knowledge itself and rendering it teachable. And a personal insight that I've gained is how this has become a part of how this knowledge moves from being personal knowledge of individual teachers into knowledge that can be shared in a professional community. In fact, I think many resources that are available to us in the form of simulations and PhET represent this kind of validated professional knowledge that has gone into the design of these simulations. The second idea that I want to discuss is this idea of active learner. Psychology is a relatively recent discipline, and the early part of its history involved a struggle to establish itself as a science. In this early phase, eschewing what seemed as highly speculative subject form of a highly speculative form of the subject of theorizing that was emerging from European psychologists, early theorizers of learning took a more experimental form and began to focus on observables. This led to the mind and its own functioning being put into a black box, and the focus being directed on input stimuli and output behavioral responses. As psychology entered into teacher education programs and began to began to provide theories that teachers could use to think about their own practice and the process of learning, teachers were taught to focus on behaviors of their students and to think of teaching as a way of producing, managing, and shaping student behavior. Directing behavior away from what is undesirable and towards what is desirable to manifest became a lot of what teachers need to work for in order to achieve. At most, the black box accounted for this thing called intelligence, which was regarded as an input variable that learners bring into the picture. Although a strictly behaviorist interpretation of intelligence would be accounted for in terms of rate of learning, that you learn fast or you learn slow, your behavior changes either fast or slow, and this is attributable to this thing called intelligence. So it was not regarded as a variable of quality of learning, but the rate at which behavioral change is achieved. As a theory of learning, teachers were expected to draw upon and use as a theory of learning that teachers were expected to draw upon and use to form their own practice. It drew attention to the need to look for embodiment as evidence of what is taught. Going through an experience was not sufficient. It had to bring about behavioral change. An assessment needed to look for evidence of behavioral change. Today, this theory is largely discredited, at least it's set aside as a learning theory relevant to the kind of learning that schools need to engage with. Neither language nor mathematics acquisition can be accounted for in terms of such a behavioral theory. Our own formal theory of thinking about learning underwent a change after what we call this cognitive revolution, first emerging from the works of Piaget. And it was when Piaget's work, which was taking place in the early 30s, got translated into English and got introduced to the West in the 60s. And the first insight that came from this cognitive revolution was the idea that learners are active and that stimulation in the world doesn't happen to the learner the way in which behaviorists were proposing, but rather that learners seek out stimulation and experience stimulation based upon the cognitive frames through which they mediate that experience, and it also gives shapes to their responses. What is experienced, therefore, is mediated through cognition, and experience itself acts and transforms cognitive frames. In other words, learners are not passive until the world happens to them. Rather, the learner's world is constructed through her activities and her active engagement with it. And the world in turn acts back on cognition. And as the learner's cognitive abilities grow, so does the world that the learner knows. This is the idea of not just active, but an interactive process, that learning is this two-way interaction. Pursuing this idea of learners as active agents and of learning as an interactive process through which the world comes to be created is a powerful idea with implications for how we think about learning and by implication, how we think about teaching. It has shaped the way in which I think about key ideas such as intelligence, practice, imitation, motivation. For example, this theory suggests that motivation is essentially intrinsic, and rather than motivating learners, maybe what teachers need to do is to remove what demotivates them. This theory suggests that perceiving a problem that needs to be solved is a consequence of some cognitive capability that is already present and not the absence of cognitive capability. In other words, there is this innate potential which enables us to recognize a problem and how it can be solved, and also begin to recognize what the solution will look like even before we have solved it. And this capability itself grows in the course of solving the problem. Apprehending the problem grows through the attempt to solve it. Guessing, for example, is intelligent behavior. It's not the absence of knowledge that leads to guessing, but rather the presence of some partial knowledge. And that search is what it manifests in the form of this response that we call guessing. Knowing, therefore, is not the So guessing, therefore, is not the response of not knowing something. Rather, it is the response that comes from having some knowledge. Interest to solve drives learning process. And therefore, rather than recruiting and shaping behavior, a lot of the teacher's work is really about recruiting and shaping interest. Our adult experience of learning tends to draw our attention away from these features, and we think we learn and then we act. But Piaget's model, for example, proposes that we act based on what we know, and thereby we learn, which in turn acts back and shapes the way in which we act. So it's really a very cyclical process, initiated by action, followed by learning, resulting in new action, rather than learning first, followed by action. Sometimes the learning of a new skill reminds us that this is the nature of learning. For example, when we learn devices, in fact, it's almost impossible to figure out how to work the device by reading the instructions and learning first and then acting. In fact, if we start acting on the device, punching the buttons, moving things around, that's when actually the learning process itself is triggered and improves our ability to act with it. In fact, this is how many young children learn devices much faster than we do and without reading any instructions. This tendency for learning to be led by action rather than action following learning is probably the reason why young children learn these devices much faster than us. This idea of learning as active and the theoretical elaboration within which it functions provides us with a novel and important way to think about and work with our students' motivation, interest, practice, and quality of learning itself. And it also problematizes for us and compels us to think, therefore, what is teaching and what does teaching need to do if this is what learning is? The idea that learning is construction has undergone much more elaboration after Piaget. It has undergone a lot of development and change. Our understanding of the world has got much more elaborated now. We understand the world to be a social, cultural, and physical world. Our understanding of active itself has moved beyond concrete action to recognize how it is socially constituted and its own social character. These are really exciting recent ideas, and they provide us with far more sophisticated ways and possibilities to theorize learning and teaching. The point I want to make now is simply that this is a powerful idea. And this idea is important, and we can't just go back to thinking about learning as a process of behavioral change, the way in which we continue to find both encoded within our own culture as well as in many teacher education programs. I'd like to now move on to the third idea, which I want to introduce as an important insight and imperative. So if you're all right with it, I'd like to go ahead with that. If you have any questions, I can pause now and take them. But otherwise, I'd like to just go ahead. Yeah.
Hello, good evening, ma'am.
Yes. Yeah.
Ma'am, I'm fairly new to this principle. I am a physics postgraduate, so my question could be trivial. So I would like to ask, as you said, the P is PCK, how hard it is to encapsulate all of the social classes and all of the while designing the curriculums for you. Like people are from different social backgrounds and everything is. So how do you know what? How do we decide what's the standard content or something for them?
How do we decide? I think it is not what standard content is, but really how to make the content speak to the learner's context and experience, isn't it? If they're not latching on to what we propose, uh, we would like them to learn from it, from the resources that they have and they bring, then I think we're not going to succeed. So maybe, I don't know whether the concept of standard content is actually the important idea to work with here. But I would say that PCK knowledge should enable us to recognize what we think from our own disciplinary perspective is important to be understood and learned about the discipline. And we have to figure out how to make that comprehensible and accessible to learners. So, for example, the examples that we use, the situations that we invoke, the significance of ideas that we introduce, many of these may be informed by our understanding and knowledge of learners' contexts.
So socio and economic backgrounds must play a different role while we are formulating illustrations and everything.
Yes, absolutely. I think our sensitivity and understanding of it is very important to factor in when we are figuring out how to present content and how to actually draw attention to what we think is significant. And what I find in experience, although I haven't taught physics for a very, very long time, is that, our own understanding of significance shifts when we begin to engage with it and allow the learner's context to enter into the process of presentation. I mean, we may have arrived at significance from our own particular contextual standpoint, and that gets renegotiated through the process of teaching.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
And we may think that this is more likely to happen in the social sciences and less likely to happen in the sciences, but I am not as sure about that, whether that would be the case. And I'm happy to have more of you in this group reflect and contribute from your experiences. Yeah.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these are two ideas that I wanted to first introduce to you. The first idea being that of pedagogical content knowledge and how it has altered the way we think about content itself, and the way in which teachers need to know content. And the second is the idea of learner as being active, and how to then think about the process of learning, but also all the attributes and the characteristics of the learning process, as well as learners. The third idea that I want to talk about is the idea of right to education. And this is the final idea that I want to present today. This idea seems to be fairly simple and uncomplicated to grasp, right? I mean, yes, everybody has a right to education, should be able to enjoy this right. I began to fully realize the transformative implication of this right only when I began to engage with the meaning of this right. And the meaning of this right doesn't just rest in the words, three words, right to education. It actually flows out of the part of the Constitution of which this right is a part. And this right to education is not a separate right listed like, a right to expression, right to belief, faith. It's sitting in the right to life, which the Constitution guarantees. It's almost the first right, and it's the most fundamental of all rights. And the right to education is sitting inside this right. It's a part of the right to life. It is not intended to make the quality of life better or enable us to live and realize life in a particular way, but it's a part of the right to life itself. I mean, we might argue that rights like right to expression or right to faith enable us to live our life in particular ways. But education is not seen in this instrumental way of improving quality of life as a second order. After it comes after life, but it is within life itself. The implication is that education is essential to life. And the guarantee to right to life is not just a biological way of being, but it's life with dignity. That's the constitutional right. It's not just right to life in some biological sense, but it's right to life in its entire social and community sense of right to life with dignity. And therefore, education is regarded as both constitutive of life and also inalienable. In other words, when we have the right to expression, we also have the possibility of remaining silent. But the right to education is not like that. You have the right to education, but you do not have the right to not have education. It is inalienable. As we work out the scope of this right, it's been translated into this Free and Compulsory Schooling Act. We begin to engage with the core aim of education itself as a right to enable us to live life with dignity. And schooling, therefore, must enable learners to acquire educational goods such as developing capabilities, accessing opportunities, realizing autonomy and agency, and experiencing oneself as worthy of respect. All these are the goods for a good life and for which education is deemed essential. At the same time, schooling, in this case, the institution of schooling, but in fact, when this right was first interpreted, when the right to life was first interpreted as guaranteeing the right to education, it was in the context of higher education. The experience of education, in this case, in the institution of schooling, because that's what the Act is promising, has to ensure that it delivers to learners educational goods, but it also has to ensure that it does not deliver to learners educational bads. It should not allow learners to experience loss of dignity, loss of confidence, lack of self-worth, fear, dependence, failure, all of which would lead to leading life without a sense of dignity. So this education has to enable us to experience life with dignity, and therefore the institutional location of it and the process through which it takes place has to enable this kind of capability to get developed in all learners who come to education. And at the same time, it has to ensure that learners do not have experiences that lead to loss of dignity, confidence, self-worth, fear, dependence, and failure. This third idea is far-reaching in its implication, and engaging with its full implication will have and should have transformatory effects on our imagination of how we institutionalize this right. Right now, the right is institutionalized in the Free and Compulsory Act, Schooling Act. So therefore, it should have implications for the curriculum, for forms of pedagogy, for who has responsibility and contributing to the learner's education. Now, let me end by arguing why I call these ideas that matter. I don't think they're just ideas. I think they are ideas that matter. These are among several ideas that are relatively new. And I say this because at one level, they seem like truisms, but they reveal their depth, their complexity, and their potential for transformation only when we begin to engage with them and their import, not simply as truisms. They sound familiar, but their meanings are in fact new and have transformatory potential. Moreover, their meaning needs to be worked out and embraced at a societal level for them to work as ideas. So these are not just ideas sitting for us to enjoy. These are ideas that have to do work. They have to change the way we do things. They have to inform the way we do things. They have to get embodied in institutions and in behaviors and in practices. And in the process of this, core contestations get revealed. And therefore, these ideas need to be grown. They need to be defended in order for them to be able to do the work that they need to do and to do this work well. Let's take, for example, this idea of pedagogical content knowledge. Embracing this idea will have implications for how we organize methodology courses, for example, in teaching programs. Indeed, the idea of methodology itself as some distinct method that gets applied on content of subject matter itself stands contested. This idea also has implications for what we should be doing when we select teachers and what we should be doing in university refresher courses, for example. In addition to introducing faculty to new research in the subject area, we should probably be equally engaging with them with pedagogical content knowledge. It also allows the possibility that those of us who are in higher education institutions involved with teaching need to develop a dual identity. Yes, a lot of our identity is drawn from the core discipline with which we identify as researchers, like the discipline of astronomy and astrophysics that Ayuka nurtures. But equally, the PCK related to our disciplinary subjects presents new researchable areas related to our work. And therefore, we have this possibility of developing this dual identity of being scholars of our discipline as well as scholars of education. Let's take the second idea of learning as active and interactive process. Taken simply to mean activity in learning, this has often been just converted into playway method, learning by doing. And in our own culture, this is seen as ways of teaching people who cannot learn through words, slow learners, learners with disabilities. And therefore, in fact, there's been widespread cultural rejection of this idea of active learning, especially when it acquires this kind of cultural meaning. Again, when we take learning to be fun, as activity learning is often interpreted, it suggests something quite contrary to our experience that learning is involves perseverance, effort, struggle. On the other hand, when we locate it within the larger theory in which active learning as a as a phrase actually emerges, we find that interactive learning and active learning can involve all these things, struggle, effort, perseverance, and it's not contrary to these kinds of experiences. Active constructive learning is sometimes also taken to mean that learners have to discover everything on their own and that there is no role for a teacher, or what is the significance of knowledge with a capital K if the only knowledge that is constructed is knowledge with a small k, or personal experience of learners. This is again an oversimplification of the idea of context or the production of civilization and culture and how they constitute the learner as well as constitute the world. So far from being a simple, familiar idea, it's a complex idea, but with immense productive potential. And it needs to interact and transform our institutions as well as the activities that we connect with teaching and learning. Finally, the idea of right to education. In our society, we're already experiencing the complexity of this idea. And I don't mean just this 25% reservation clause, which is applicable to private schools. We find that this right is challenging cultural beliefs that are pervasive in Indian society regarding educability of caste and gender. It's challenging the widespread belief that learning requires fear and the threat of failure. In fact, this has already been contested. The famous Bukkal committee report, of which Professor Panchapakeshan was a part, has actually invokes the need for fear to enable Indian learners to engage with the learning process seriously. So clearly, the right to education, simple as it sounds, has a lot of work to do. And it's an idea that needs to be defended. It's an idea that matters. This is also an idea that could have shaped the way we have responded to COVID and the implications of the lockdown. I mean, schools were closed, but does it mean that for 2 years, children had no education, no experiences that we would count as educationally valuable? What happened in those 2 years and what were children learning? Does this broader notion of the right to education enable us to re-engage with um, the learning process and educational experiences of learner, broadening our imagination of curriculum and pedagogy beyond what we have known um, to take place within the institution of schools? So you can see why I call these ideas that matter. All these seem to be at one idea, at level ideas that are obvious, but as we work out their implications, we can see that they really have implications for how we think and organize our practice. And we also find that they are challenged and contested. They are far from simple ideas that everybody simply accepts. In fact, in the form of truisms, these ideas are so dumbed down, they don't simply get to do the work they need to do in our society. So I think these are ideas that matter. We need to restore the complexity and the importance of these ideas and enable them to get worked out, uh, work their way through society, through the meanings that we intend these ideas to carry and achieve their transformatory effect in society. So these are the ideas that I wanted to share with you. And for the remaining time that we have together, I'm happy to hear your questions or observations and have a conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Sarangapani, for a very illuminating and thought-provoking talk on ideas that matter. We touched upon very, very basic but very important ideas of PCK, learning by action, drawing in the theory from Jean Piaget, and the right to education. And it is something so fundamental that our constitution, the preamble, which assures the dignity of the individual and for the unity and integrity of the nation, that you drew the linkages between the right to education and the dignity of the individual. So thank you very much. And we just open the floor for discussion, comments, and any sort of reactions as well. Thank you very much. So you can unmute yourself. If you have problems unmuting, or if your mic is not working, you can put it in the chat box as well. Shomak has his hands up. Shomak, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much, Padma, for this wonderful talk. And I'm so glad that you agreed to also talk in this series. Right to education, I think I know you've thought about this a lot. The right to education is certainly one of the ideas that matters. But is it enough? My question is, isn't right to good education a more important idea? And of course, one cannot control the level of education or the quality of education one gets. Of course, right to education doesn't force me to take my kid to the nearest school, but it certainly, and gives me the right to teach them at home, for example. But how does one ensure that in the end, one has the choice of education that one requires for their kids? I mean, given the competition out in the market now, I see very, very difficult, particularly in urban environments, for parents to enroll their kids and things like that.
Yeah. So yeah, Shomak, it's nice to be on this forum. So thanks for having me here. I think you're right about the right to education. And that's the reason why I said, that the right to education has to guarantee educational goods and has to also guarantee that we will not have educational bads being delivered through the educational process. And I think what we've done with the right to education is to fit it to an institution with which we are familiar, which is the school, and really reducing or kind of really imagining this right around school as we've known it. But we know that school was not actually designed to deliver the right to education. It had different aims, and over centuries, the aims of education provided the school have actually been developing and shifting and acquiring new forms. So I think at the juncture in which we are, we can very well raise the question that when we are guaranteeing the right to education, is school the best and the only place to deliver and realize this right? I think certainly we can problematize the institution of school. We don't have to automatically accept that it is the only institution through which this right can be delivered. But I think it reminds us, of certain educational goods for which the family may not be sufficient. For example, the right to life with dignity. The Indian imagination of the right to life with dignity includes ideas of liberal ideas, which are in the Constitution. It includes ideas of autonomy and agency, which in fact may or may not be subscribed to by families, right? So it has to play this complex role between a societal imagination of educational good and a family imagination of educational good. So there are competing authorities, but it cannot be a competitive space, right? It ultimately we have to find a way of collaboratively achieving educational goods for students. So I think these are actually questions which we have not thought about adequately. And the current formulation of the right to education in the Free and Compulsory Act is almost completely silent about the role of parents and the choices that it only gives parents the choice to choose between schools, but it doesn't give them any authority to shape what goes on in schools. It's silent on many of these questions. And I think we will be justified in raising these questions and articulating in our own arguments for why we think they're important. Yeah.
Shameen, you have your hand up. Thanks.
Sanjit here.
Sanjit, hi Sanjit.
Yeah. So very nice talk, Padma, for clearly explaining three of the key concepts or ideas. So my question is about the refresher courses that we do for the higher education, especially college and university teachers. See, we should certainly have some form of PCK included in such curriculum, especially for teachers. Now, the thing is that how do you know what is the situation in the country about these refresher courses in science in different streams? I mean, are there any institution who has done something to at least give some flavor of PCK to the teachers who are teaching, let's say, in IITs or universities? I mean, my understanding is that everywhere that what is taught, the knowledge, the training that happens is purely the technical part of it, but the PCK is quite missing. So, yeah. So could you please say something about that?
I think you're absolutely right. I think this idea of PCK is actually new, especially in higher education. I don't think we have sufficiently reflected on this question. I mean, we all know there are textbooks that are good and textbooks that are not, but we have not understood what makes a textbook good through this lens of the insight of PCK that the textbook is actually giving us access to. I think it's worth articulating it and bringing it into the discussion. I mean, right now, refresher courses mainly deal with new content and research that may be available in the discipline. And at best, they're introducing skills. They're introducing how to use a PPT kind of skills. And so they're reducing this entire part, which really should be understood as PCK, into a set of skills of communication that teachers seem to lack. And I think this is like the inadequacy of our imagination, which can undergo a change if we bring in this idea more forcefully of PCK into discussion. And I don't think it is only a matter of ways of representing content, which is of course a very important part, the multiplicity of representations, but is also understanding of learners and learner context and bringing that into the teaching learning process. I think in India, we are really backward. I can think of almost no education department that actually researches pedagogy and curriculum in higher education. In the Indian context, it doesn't exist. I was recently in Africa and I find they're actively thinking about higher education, teaching and learning. So I think many of these TLCs that this Madan Mohan Malviya scheme has introduced, I think should begin to, focus more on this and not just reduce it to skill learning and communication, but be able to show the interaction of content knowledge. I mean, the need to understand subject matter in order to develop pedagogy, but also distinguish between the two. I think there's a lot of interesting work that can happen, which isn't currently happening in this space.
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea, and I think the scientists in the like people who are teaching pure science and physics, astronomy, etc., should probably work with social scientists to come up with a scheme by which the system can be slowly changed instead of probably bringing any dramatic change. Let's say 20% lectures would be on how to teach or like how to get towards PCK, if not completely. I mean, changing the whole thing dramatically would be probably difficult because people who are doing this training also have to be trained. I mean, there are multiple layers of training necessary. But I think in the beginning, at least maybe very soon, if people work together, then something can be done. Maybe we can explore those ideas.
And definitely, I think there is also a lot of research publication in these areas. It's not only that which we can draw upon to kind of develop our own conceptions and, have the right vocabularies to be able to describe what we do as teachers. I think there is, in fact, I feel this is unexplored new areas for research that we could be looking at and developing. Most higher education spaces don't give us much opportunity to speak about teaching and learning. Right? I think there's a lot of possibility and need for that. Yeah.
Padma, I have since I'm sorry. Can I ask one related question?
Sure, please go ahead, Sanjit.
Yeah. I mean, so you did not mention anything about NEP here. So do you think NEP provides any scope for this kind of exploration?
I don't know whether it explicitly refers to it, but I think, I think they talk about quality of teaching in higher education as well. They definitely recognize that. And I don't think the section on teacher education needs to be read as being restricted to just school education. I think it equally applies to undergraduate post. In fact, undergraduate education is so weak in our country. We've hardly paid attention to how to design for it, improve its quality. So I think there's nothing in the NEP that goes against it. I think there's enough that it says that kind of would favor such an agenda.
It was actually a trick question from Shuni.
Well, I mean, ideas are one thing, and then providing support is also another thing.
Well, yesterday I was in a meeting of the Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya scheme. They were, of course, telling us how to submit our statements of expenditure through the new accounting system, but they were kind of suggesting that maybe the scheme will be continued. So let's hope, let's make a case that there are important agendas to be pursued. And why the scheme needs to continue.
Yeah, that will be wonderful. I think the whole idea of teaching learning has to be introduced at some point in the teaching learning centers. I mean, of course, COVID made a big impact here. But on the other hand, I think if they continue the scheme, then there are a lot of things which we can explore.
Yeah, and maybe one should try to put together a white paper on why these teaching learning centers need to continue to exist and what they should be aiming to do to kind of add some more motivation to support the continuation of the scheme. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add to your comment on very little research on higher education, that the National Institute of Education Planning and Administration, which brings out these annual volumes, for the next year, 2023, the volume is on research on higher education, although not much is being done. They're trying to put together whatever is being done.
Yes, you're absolutely right. NEPA is the only center which is actually doing, and this annual series that they have, the yearbooks, a very important source of this. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll move on to Manav Devekar.
Yes, so I work at ISER Pune. So on a project called MSDEED. So it's a project run with in a collaboration with Maharashtra State Faculty Development Academy. And firstly, your talk was really wonderful, and especially the part about PCK, because in a kind of small sense, that is what we are trying to do for the college teachers in Maharashtra. So I agree with all of your points that yes, we don't really talk about how to deal with the content. As you said, most of the fresher courses are just about teaching particular skills rather than actually talking about PCK. And we are trying to do that bit by bit, but it's really a long way to go. And we would really like to have your, help to do that, because we just concluded a 10-day workshop for college teachers in Maharashtra. And what we also understood, or what we noticed, is that if we take away the whole language aspect of it, it goes much better. So we conducted almost 80% of the workshop in Marathi, and the effectiveness increased tremendously according to us. So there are so many aspects to doing this, so that it's more effective. Yeah.
It would be really nice if the next time you do it, you are able to have an observer or a researcher actually recording what you're doing.
Yes.
Because I suspect that when you use a different language, the way in which you draw attention to things, the examples that you use, the form of articulation actually undergoes a shift. And I think that's really important for us to be able to, qualitatively look at your experiences and reflect on. And I think adding that component will really enable us to not just leave it as an experience, where we got a job done, but to be able to cumulatively grow it and convert it into some kind of professional knowledge that can be shared in the community. I think that's something as educators we don't do enough. These are like personal journeys that we have. And they remain anecdotes that we share when we bump in a corridor, but it doesn't get.
And also we were hopefully able to, get the teachers to focus on reflection in general as a tool, because there's so little reflection happening. I mean, it's one of the most useful things ever, like just reflecting on the experience that you have. And we tried to get that reflection itself as a tool across to teachers.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, ma'am. But I will definitely write to you about our program, and I would definitely, I mean, we definitely need help from people like you.
Yeah, happy to.
Definitely.
In fact, MSFDA, I feel is, I mean, is an organization with some enthusiasm, energy, and potential. And I'm also looking forward to what we can do
Yes,
together with
great.
them. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, ma'am.
A really very inspiring and useful book that I read many years ago was one by Janet Donald called Teaching and Learning in the Disciplines.
Okay.
Which is a fascinating book, both for the methodology that she uses to reflect on teaching and learning in higher education, as well as the insights that she offers us. And the methodology is unique because she constructed this research based on in-depth interviews with teachers in higher education on what they were trying to achieve when they were teaching and how they were going about doing it. And through that in-depth interview, she's been able to reconstruct this fascinating account of what it means, and what do teachers do. And I think we need work like that because it's a combination of both our understanding of the discipline as well as context.
Right.
That really informs what we're trying to achieve and how we go about doing it, what stands out as significant in our effort. And I think we should really be thinking of constructing research projects of this kind that we could pursue.
Yeah, I will definitely have a look at that book, ma'am. Thank you so much.
There's a comment on the chat. Could you please repeat the name of the book?
Yeah, I will write it down.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So we will move on to Bindu.
Thank you, Padma, for the talk. It got me thinking about the Right to Education Act. We always seem to see it in a legal framework. At least that seems to be forefronted a lot when we discuss the right to education. And this question you were asked about the quality, about good education and the quality of education, and your response saying that it's not only institute and schooling that we should be looking at when we talk about the right to education. I'm wondering, does the legal framework actually impede, as the kind of creating good quality learning experiences, or is it in any way useful to keep the legal framework in mind? It seems like it's a barrier.
I think the legal framework represents a consensus that has been achieved on norms and standards and the meaning of good quality education. It represents a consensus, but we are in a democracy continuing to deliberate on and trying to renegotiate the consensus. So we have to keep the conversation alive. It's not like a done deed. Also, the legal framework is a pragmatic framework. It has to be realizable within a set of given circumstances and a certain set of resources that are available. Yeah, but it's not the ideal, right? So we can aspire beyond. Maybe for many people, even the present legal framework is very aspirational. Maybe there are those of us who aspire beyond it, right? So I think the conversation around the legal framework and its norms and standards needs to be kept alive. And this is the nature of any right which is realized in a political space, right? That it needs to be pragmatically negotiated ultimately. It has to be realizable. So the language of it is really to be operationalized. It represents that operational imagination very much. But I think like any right, we continue to deliberate, deepen, right? Even the present form itself has deepened our understanding so much. In fact, I feel that those of us on the middle classes, until it was formulated in the legal framework, none of us even read the drafts. We just thought that right to education was for the poor. We didn't realize it had implications even for the middle classes. We thought it was about giving rights to somebody who didn't have that right, not realizing that that right was far more pervasive in its implication for society as a whole. And I think that really tells us, right, that this is a societal process. So that negotiation is on. And I think it's a good thing, right? We've understood the right in a new way through this legal framework, and we will continue to deliberate and grow it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just to add to that comment, Bindu's question that about the legal framework, that the right to education, after it was passed, was also challenged in the Supreme Court. And it was dismissed with a very few words, saying cut the flap somewhere else, because when it was argued that the money which would be required would be huge and the government cannot afford it, that it was dismissed with just these few words. So the legal support was there right from the early days. But going back to Shomuk's question, actually, when you mentioned about the right to education, the schools being the fallback option, that what are the other aspects you see or other ways of actually enhancing what the quality and spread of the right to education? Shomuk mentioned about right to good education, but in the foreseeable future or even in the more distant future, what are the different ways you foresee of trying to make significant progress in this?
The school as an institution is important, and at least for me, it continues to be a very important site to realize the right to education. And I'm saying this especially because I can see the emergence of these arguments suggesting that somehow COVID has taught us that we can use technology to achieve the goals of the right to education. And I'm concerned about that because I think that the space, the institutional space enables certain things to happen, certain forms of peer group formation coming together, which we lose sight. I mean, we will lose if we just focus on learning and reduce education to learning, not realizing that there is a political aim as well as in it, a social aim as well in it, and just reducing it to learning goals associated with academic and scholastic outcomes. So I'm feeling the need to deepen our understanding of the meaning of the institutional experience. We may broaden it. We may want to reimagine how it functions, who participates in it, what it offers to learners, and so on. I think definitely, but at least now, as a reaction, I'm thinking that we have not adequately imagined the school space itself and its educational potential. And I'm thinking that there's some work that we need to do for that. I think that the role of parent and home as contributing to right to education, at least during COVID, I thought about that a lot. And even the space of the community as offering opportunities for realizing the right to education. And I feel that we've done almost nothing in these areas in India. We've been very focused on school and an academic curriculum to be delivered. And that there's a lot of work that needs to happen there. The third is that I feel that the imagination of the school curriculum is extremely narrow in the Indian context. And it's highly focused on a very scholastic imagination of education, which we have inherited. We have not reworked it. Many other colonial countries have radically reworked their imagination of what school offers, and we have not done that. We have, we've remained with this largely colonial imagination. And so whether it happens in schools or other learning spaces around the school, I don't know, but I think the curricular scope, definitely, there's immense potential to expand it and reimagine it. Yeah.
Thanks. There's a question from hands up from Virjesh Singh. We'll probably take one or two more questions. We'll take a gallery shot at the end, so please stay on.
Yeah.
Virjesh, you can unmute your question.
Yes. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your insightful, you can say, discussion regarding, you can say, very, very important points. And recently, I got opportunity to interact with the community members that how we can develop home as a learning space for the children. And community members were really happy that the way we were discussing that they can use home to support children. Like if they are not able to read and write, they can simply ask their children to sit beside them early in the morning, in the evening hours, or in the leisure time. And if they are not able to do this alone, they can take the support of their, you can say, neighborhood support. The women who have completed their 10th, or you can say 10 plus 2, or have done graduation, but they are leading a life of simple housewife and doing homely things in their day-to-day life. And in community, women come together and they share their problems. And we said that you all can come together, sit at a place and call 10 or you can say 8 students of your own family, and they can also read in circle or in groups. And they really find that these ideas are very helpful, and this will support the community processes, because in the village areas, the isolation which was you can say very much part of city life is prevailing in village life also.
Right.
People don't go, you can say, neighborhood and ask for support until unless it is very urgent or important. So I think reaching out community and developing a sense of self-efficacy among parents that they can support.
Right.
So
No, I think, yeah. Yeah, you're quite right.
I wanted to
Yeah.
hear that, ma'am. Thank you.
I think what you've shared is quite important. And I think also the important thing is that we don't see these things as instrumental, that this will, enable the child to succeed in school. But the school can see, I mean, there is the possibility that the school leaders, the teaching community in school reimagines the work that happens in the school and the work that happens in such spaces as contributing to the child's education. It should certainly be possible for us to do that, and not only looking at as a complementing the work that essentially happens in the space of school.
Thanks very much. So we'll take the last question from Arindam Bose from TIS.
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually quite intrigued by that question which you asked at the end, that what do schools offer after all? And particularly looking at what's the meaning of teaching and learning, particularly in context of coming from a developing world context, where, you also mentioned about funds of knowledge. So drawing from there, communities, funds of knowledge, knowledge which is preserved in the community, and where, often, people coming from those marginalized communities may not even recognize knowledge that we sell, I'm using that word, sell, through schooling as proper knowledge setup, like work or learning through vocation is what is valued. Now, how do we look at learning? I mean, what is then valued and what is learning and teaching? I'm not able to articulate my question well, but point is, this is altogether a different set of learning and teaching going on, which actually goes unnoticed, perhaps, and do you see what I mean? So it's actually a different set. So actually, you're right. I mean, we must think about what do schools offer after all, and certainly schools are not the only site of learning, if that that happens. So yeah, I mean, is there any hope of drawing some of these ideas and knowledge resources, cultural resources, cultural insights, which prevail all around us, but go unnoticed?
Well, definitely there seems to be an agenda to decolonize curricular content, isn't it? That we see evident even the NEP, but it takes forms and shapes that may draw from different kinds of interpretations of culture. It could be an ancient past, it could be a recent community, it could be a tribal community. And I think these ideas have to be negotiated. And it's clearly a part of a larger political agenda. It has to have wider political consensus. Many of us know that early initiatives to educate children in tribal languages were rejected by tribal communities themselves. So even these ideas that we are proposing are not as easy for to achieve societal consensus on it. But I think that's the reason why I call them ideas that matter. We just have to keep figuring out how to widen engagement with them, deepen understanding of the implication and scope of these ideas, and continue to keep them alive to do the work they need to do for us as a society. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much for a wonderful evening and a very insightful talk, and a lot for us to think and reflect upon.